I have no idea. The thing we're going to talk about today is world historical context and how world historical context relates to the Industrial Revolution. The main thing that you've read so far in chapter 18 is that the Industrial Revolution started in Britain, and there is a debate among historians, as there always is, about historiography and the story of why the Industrial Revolution started. The traditional view of the Industrial Revolution is that the Industrial Revolution happened because of English inventiveness, that England was smarter, that they had a textile industry because they were destined to succeed. They were just better at it than everyone else. There are problems with this, among which are that this is terribly Eurocentric, which world historians tend not to support. Aside from that, this ignores all sorts of data from the rest of the world. The fact that China had the leading economy for pretty much the entirety of world history up to this point, and even in 1700, Britain was not far ahead of pretty much anyone. Britain was falling behind other European powers like Spain and Portugal. They were also in a pretty limited economic space compared to places like China. So it doesn't make any sense, really, with evidence that Britain was just destined to succeed given they hadn't succeeded so far. The other problem is it becomes deterministic, like it's supposed to happen, like history was bound to happen this way, that Britain was just supposed to end up industrializing first. The reality is that Britain's industrialization exists within the context of what was going on in international trade and Britain's colonies. So the modern view is that the Industrial Revolution was sparked because of the influence of India on Britain in the 1700s, that there are several different trends going on, including Britain's free trade policies, the availability of coal, somewhat close to the supply lines and rail lines, but the reality is that Britain's policies and India's policies coexist during this time period. So the argument I want to make is the argument that India is essential to understanding how Britain industrializes. To start off with, I want to take a snapshot of the picture of 1700. This is the end of the blue folder, before the orange folder. Great Britain has a strong demand for cotton, but in particular for Indian cotton textiles. India in 1700 was the world's #1 exporter of cotton textiles. The reason why is that they had high quality and low price. And pretty much you can't beat that, right? That's the best thing ever if you're making products. So Britain is a net importer of Indian cotton textiles in 1700. But the big question though is why, right? What is India doing so well that Britain's not doing? There are a couple different possible explanations for this. One of the ideas was that India's standard of living was so much lower, so they could afford to pay their workers less. So Indian cotton is cheaper because their workers are getting jacked. But the reality is that's not true, that the Indian standard of living in 1700 was just as high as that of Britain. The real reason was agriculture. In the time period before the Industrial Revolution, 1700 including this, pre-industrial families spent about 60 to 80% of their incomes on food. 60 to 80%. That means most of the money that they're making goes to feed themselves. They have very little money left over for anything else. By way of comparison, we probably in America today spend somewhere between 20-25% of our incomes on food. The difference here is that Asian agriculture was twice as productive as European agriculture in 1700. So the fact that there were productive agriculture, which lowers the cost of crops, means that Indian wages were lower than British wages, Okay, so you could pay Indian workers less and therefore make cheaper products, but it means the Indians, the people in India, had more purchasing power. They could buy food more readily and they could buy food more easily with less money. So even though they were paid less, their standard of living was still as high and their products were cheaper. As an aside, I feel like my voice becomes very John Green-ish during these videos. I'll give him credit for that, I guess. We'll see. I'll try to create my own voice as we go. Here's a chart of that same idea. So in India, you have very high crop yields, which means prices of food are relatively low. They can charge lower wages, or companies can pay lower wages because food is so cheap and people can still survive. This puts Indian commercialism, Indian textiles, at a competitive advantage versus Britain. So Britain, because they had lower crop yields, food was relatively higher priced. You had to spend more money to get enough food, which meant wages had to be higher. So wages were higher in Britain than in India, but the British textile manufacturing was still a competitive disadvantage versus India. All has to do with food. So that's a snapshot of 1700. I probably spent way too much time talking about that, but I like to say things over and over again for no apparent reason. So here's what Britain does to respond. Two things. The first one is mercantilism. So Britain tries to promote a policy that would try to increase protectionism. The mercantilist philosophy said that you should try to increase exports, send more goods away, and reduce imports. If you increase exports, you can increase the amount of money you earn, the amount of gold and silver you accumulate, and reducing imports is good because imports just mean you're sending that money out to someone else. So, in 1707, Britain bans the importation of Indian textiles into England. The goal was to help and promote British manufacturing, so they promote domestic manufacturing by limiting foreign goods that would be competitive. The problem was that Britain still couldn't compete with India, and so basically they only produced cotton for domestic markets. So if you wanted a cotton shirt, you had been buying it from India, you had to buy it in Britain, but it's not like British companies were successful in the international market. So mercantilism is a philosophy that makes sense if you're trying to develop and build domestic industries, but it doesn't necessarily make sense if you're going to try to promote free trade and support selling your products all over the world. So tariffs or taxes on imported goods, this is really what Britain does to try to reduce competition to promote domestic industry. The other thing they do, though, is they develop colonies. And colonies are not totally new for Britain, but they really hadn't developed colonies in the same way that Spain and Portugal has. From 1600 to 1700, British colonial overseas enterprises were relatively limited, and that changes in 1700. So you have the British East India Company. We've already talked about that from the Blue Folder. Their goal was to promote trade. Their goal was not to spread Christianity, not to make war. They tried to focus on India because they could therefore avoid conflicts with other European powers. So you had Spain with the Philippines. You initially had Portugal, but then you had the Dutch controlling the Spice Islands and the Moluccas, and those entities, the control of those entities was already intact by 1700. So Britain tries to stay out of their way, focus on India where no one else had any control over. The situation in India, though, contributes to this. So the Mughal Empire was in decline after 1707. This is interesting. This is the same year. In 1707, the last great Mughal leader dies, and there is no national unity within India. You have regional, political, military leaders asserting claims of independence. You have a power struggle going on within the kind of breaking up of the Mughal dynasty, and this creates a power vacuum. It creates political space for England to come in and assert control over India. Uh, Britain formally takes over India as a colony in 1857. So this takes a long time, right? This is not from 1700 to 1857. We're talking about the majority of the Orange Folder. At the same time, the gradual takeover of Britain allows Britain to be able to promote the exports of goods from Britain, export of British cotton textiles, and it also gives Britain access to Indian cotton, which makes it a little bit cheaper. So I have this unnecessarily difficult and complicated chart that I created. I have no idea why I made it this complicated. It makes sense to me in my head. I don't think it makes sense to anyone else. I'll attempt to explain it because I wanted to identify elements of world historical context on Britain's Industrial Revolution. So we have two elements of world historical context going on here. One is in Asia, with India in particular, and one is in the Americas. So British policies, you first have Britain at a competitive disadvantage. The reason why: Indian agricultural productivity. So the fact that India has productive agriculture helps put Britain at a competitive disadvantage. That's an example of a world historical context argument. So Britain attempts to create a policy of colonies and a policy of mercantilism. The fact that India had political disunity makes the colonial process easier. So a second piece of world historical context. You have a trend that's going on in India. It influences British policies. Once Britain has colonies, they have a philosophy of mercantilism. They need to create new markets. The place that they create new markets is in part in India, but in part in the Americas. And in particular, you have slavery in the Americas. Slavery means a need for clothes. You have slave owners who need to clothe their slaves. The place that this creates a built-in market for British textiles to export to the Americas. So the fact that you have slave owners in the Americas purchasing cotton goods creates another element of world historical context. It's another trend going on outside of Britain that influences Britain's ability to industrialize. Along with that, you have the creation of the cotton gin in 1793. Eli Whitney created the cotton gin. It's short for cotton engine. It's a device that allows the mechanization of cotton production and allows, in particular, the separation of seeds, of cotton seeds, from the cotton that you use to make clothes. That process had been done by hand up to this point. It's terribly difficult, really hard to do. The cotton gin makes it much easier. The cotton gin was made in America. That technology is transferred to Britain and puts Britain at a competitive advantage because they can now produce cotton so cheaply. So that's another instance of world historical context that allows Britain to maintain a competitive advantage. This also increases reliance on American cotton because Britain can produce so much more cotton and export their goods around the world. They're not producing the cotton, they're producing the cotton textiles. So they need raw materials. They need cotton from America, which increases reliance on American cotton. This also helps to perpetuate American slavery. So the fact that you have slavery existing in the South is in part because of British demand for the raw material of cotton that will propel them to a competitive advantage in industrialization and textiles. The result of this, and I think this is pretty ironic, is that Britain by 1800 becomes, and certainly by 1850, certainly by the end of the Orange Folder, Britain becomes the #1 leader in the promotion of free trade, that every country should have access to sell their goods overseas wherever they want. This is the exact opposite of mercantilism. Mercantilism says close off your imports and produce domestically, and that made sense given they had a competitive disadvantage in 1700, but because of all these elements of world historical context, they were able to have a competitive advantage, which means they start promoting free trade all over the world. That's my video. Go team.